I am very pleased tonight. I know a lot of you in the audience, because I've been chatting with you, have already seen presentations by Dr. Chris Impey. He's an amazing presenter. We're very pleased to have him with us tonight. He's going to talk about the science fiction of Mars. Can I get a big round of applause for Chris Impey?
Okay, thanks very much. It's great to see such a big crowd. I'm going to channel my inner angry God for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions. So I'm going to talk about Mars as it has appeared in various fictional guises and mention perhaps some of the more factual aspects of Mars. Mars penetrated the popular consciousness due to Percival Lowell. Percival Lowell, of course, was a Boston merchant who retired, had an avid interest in science, so he's an amateur scientist, but quite a well-rounded one. He built his telescope. He came out west. He found beautiful dark skies near Flagstaff. He built a telescope. He fired his assistant, who didn't want to buy into his story of civilizations on Mars, and thanks to that, Stewart Observatory was founded, so I'm grateful to Percival Lowell for my job. And of course, what he saw through the telescope, because it was the closest approach of Mars for decades, and because no one had a large telescope on a great site, could not be replicated. So there was no one for a while who could countermand his story of a dying civilization on Mars that was transporting, he thought, water ice from the poles to the equator. And indeed, if you've ever looked through a small telescope, those moments where the seeing gets very sharp, you can imagine you see linear features. So he was using wishful thinking, but he was also trying to represent by drawings what he saw in the instance when the seeing was good, not overall when it just varies all the time. Well, he was mistaken. The features are not strictly linear, but the paintings and evocative images he drew in a popular book he wrote a few years after this, around the turn of the century, cemented the idea of Mars as a living world with a dying civilization, and this backstory was used, of course, extensively by science fiction many years later. Also, this is the time of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, so those twin events, that great, early science fiction, and the observations made from this state put Mars into everyone's minds. And of course, there were artists who were happy to evoke the situations of Mars, the death and destruction that might come to us from the Martians who had been watching us, biding their time, waiting for their moment, as H.G. Wells put it. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, Mars, this sort of idea of life on Mars blossomed into sort of lurid, cartoonish fantasy world. This is, of course, Edgar Rice Burroughs, the Barsoom series, John Carter, and so Mars is full of, well-muscled warriors and buxom women and creatures, imaginary creatures, and so on. It seems like kind of a wild place on a Saturday night, a good place for a holiday, perhaps, if you had a nice, safe, secure location. And this series of books by Edgar Rice Burroughs, before he got famous, more famous probably for Tarzan, was pulp fiction, of course, almost the definition of pulp fiction. But it was very well read and widely read. So this further cemented the idea that we should not even be surprised if there's creatures on Mars, life on Mars. And probably the pinnacle of the fervor for life on Mars came in this very famous incident from the era of radio, when you actually had to use your imagination because there were no images and the words could evoke incredible ideas and images. Orson Welles, wunderkind in Hollywood, who'd sort of made his name with Citizen Kane, and before he sort of flamed out, he only had a short arc as a famous director. But before he went into film, he ran the Mercury Theater Company, which was a live radio company that spawned, Joseph Cotton. I could reel off a list of names. Many of the famous actors, stage and TV and movie actors of the middle part of the 20th century went through his theater company. It was the place to be. And in 1938, on the eve of the Second World War, and that folds into this story, of course, because in 1938, it was really clear in Europe that war was going to come very, very soon. In the United States, that larger separation and the longer time before the U.S. went into the war, it made it seem a little remote, but there was definitely a lot of anxiety. And so he was sort of tapping into that when he did this radio show. And he did it in a very artful way. So I'll play I'll play the beginning. So it was framed as a broadcast of live dance music. And if you were listening to this live dance music and you missed the disclaimer at the very beginning of the show, which many people did, you would have heard this about 5 minutes in.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Ramon Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
And so that was how the show proceeded. You'd have dance music, and every 5 or 7 minutes, someone would burst in with an update of this thing that was happening in New Jersey with increasing urgency. And the final interruption in this show, and people, of course, were riveted to this, happened like this.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmer's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain is conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Oh, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object, while the captain and 2 policemen advance with something in their hands. I can say it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's covered by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
And he left 10 seconds of what they call dead air. And in broadcasting, that you never leave dead air. You know, someone will just burble meaninglessly over the dead air. But he did it for effect. And by the time, the end of that clip, plus some dead air, people in New Jersey were bundling into their station wagons and their trucks, and they were putting all their possessions with them. They were jamming the freeways, and roughly 100,000 people took this seriously enough to cause a mass panic. Now, Wells was interviewed afterwards and just swore that he had no malintention, and he made a disclaimer at the beginning of the show, and he had no idea it would cause such upset. But, you know, nobody really believed that. Anyway, people did want to believe. So in this time and in that way, Mars was cemented as a very ominous place indeed. So we have the Ark of Fiction from the 20th century. And this, of course, starts this is 1918, so the Edgar Rice Burroughs series runs through the 1920s and the 1930s and got a lot of readership. Then it moves into some sort of classic science fiction, O.F. Stapleton in 1930. And in Stapleton's work and also in C.S. Lewis' work from 1938, Mars is being used as a metaphor and as a basis for drawing some very grand conclusions about our place in the universe, about the arc of human civilization. So when writers of the caliber, O.F. Stapleton's not perhaps as famous as he should be, he's a very fine writer, C.S. Lewis is famous, some great writers, not traditionally science fiction writers, used Mars as a vehicle for telling some quite imaginative and grand stories about civilizations and the arc of human life. Then, of course, we enter the classic age of science fiction, 1950, The Martian Chronicles. the first science fiction book ever reviewed in the New York Times and on the front page of the New York Times that day. It sort of broke through the barrier that had existed. Of course, you know, the pulp fiction sort of created science fiction as a ghetto. And in 1950, Ray Bradbury was the first person to break through that ghetto and create literary science fiction that had the worthy readership of people who may not have normally read science fiction. So that's the golden age of science fiction, many writers participating in that. So I'm not going to show a lot of that. I'll just hop forward to a great title from the 1990s, which is Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars. The Red, Green, Mars trilogy of Kim Stanley Robinson, not trained as a scientist, he's a writer, journalist, is an incredible evocation of Mars after we terraform it, after we have colonies there, after the Martian civilization diverges enough from human civilization that they have their own goals, motives, and they want to cut the cord. And the humans, of course, the Earthlings, do not want to do that because Mars is a resource-rich place. It's a fascinating story. The 3 books play out over centuries. So there's an amazing amount, and this I will give Chris Kokinos in the English department in the Poetry Center credit for this list because it includes other titles I'm not mentioning now. Meanwhile, in film, Mars was getting an analogous treatment. So we can start in 1938, the year of the H.G. Wells radio broadcast, with pretty much the same theme. Mars is an evil place, the god of war, the nemesis, a civilization that could destroy us, that would invade us. 1950, we have similar ideas. Now we're in the classic age of science fiction. 1954, Devil Girl from Mars. It's getting pretty lurid. And you may have thought, listening to the H.G. Wells radio broadcast, well, now who would fall for that? That's like cheesy B-grade science fiction. Well, yeah, that's what it was. That's all there was. It's only in hindsight, in the rearview mirror, that we call that cheesy B-grade science fiction. At the time, that was the only way people had thought or heard about these strange places and the possibility that there might be creatures there. And then I'll hop forward many movies, of course, into the early 90s for some of the more cheesy, cartoonish views of Mars. I mean, pretty much playing Mars for comedic value. So many books, many science fiction books, many of which are extremely imaginative, and hundreds of them essentially, and dozens of movies through the century. What about the real Mars? Well, the real Mars also went through this arc. It was built up, it was pumped up by Percival Lowell to be this place where a civilization was, where there was life, maybe dying life, but life. And in the 1970s, when the first orbiters went there, we realized that Mars was an arid desert and probably lifeless. But the real Mars the pendulum has swung back to the point where Mars is likely to be habitable, and indeed there could be microbes under the surface, in subsurface aquifers. Not on the surface. If you put a cup of water on the surface of Mars, it will boil/evaporate in a fraction of a second. The atmosphere, 1% of the air you're breathing, the temperature extremely cold. But there are habitable locations on Mars and very strong evidence that Mars had liquid water on its surface for long periods of time, several billion years ago. But the real Mars, even though it is a desert, it's not by any means a boring desert. I don't have to tell a set of desert dwellers that the desert is not as boring as the people who don't live in the desert think it might be. So here is the Martian desert, first of all in monochrome. So you can see it's not that boring. In fact, I mean, the geological formations and the dunes are very obvious, and I'm not going to show you the face on Mars, which has been debunked, but you could see some of these features and be forgiven for thinking that some artificial intelligent hand was involved in the creation of these features. Well, let's pump it up a bit into color. Now this is admittedly amped up color. So it is a gorgeous desert, of course. What about life on Mars? Well, like I said, there might be subsurface microbial life, and it's a disappointment to many people, even some planetary scientists who work in this field, that the Mars rovers, those clever little automated vehicles that we sent to Mars, have not actually engaged in the life detection experiment. That has not actually been done since the 1970s, an instrument that Carl Sagan had a good hand in. And to some people, that seems very timid, because there may well be life under the surface. On top of the surface, probably not, and if you're going to find big life on Mars, you're going to need some different strategies.
Okay, everyone focus. Prepare to enter the atmosphere. Let's get this thing off the ground.
Okay, we have parachute online.
Okay, inflate airbags. Open. Camera off. Gonna have a picture right now. Thank you, Germany. Okay, there's more to do. Now, if there is life, the Dutch will find it. Wait. What is he doing? What is that?
Now we wait.
So we're in the right place, obviously. So probably not big life on Mars, probably just microbial under the ground. And actually Mars has been getting a lot of attention to, again, I have no skin in the game. I'm an astronomer. The nearest objects I've ever studied with a telescope are 1 billion light years away. So if it's closer than that, I don't care. And Mars is a lot closer than that. But I do care about Mars. Even planetary scientists will tell you they think Mars has got a disproportionate share of the attention. They would tell you, we'd love to go to Titan. We'd love to go to Europa and do life detection. I mean, and some of those moons of the giant planets also have all the ingredients for life: water, energy source, carbon-rich material. Mars is close. It's relatively easy, relatively quick to get there, so it's getting a lot of attention. And you may not know, but the number of missions that are either already there or heading there actually could make it slightly crowded. So let's bring it to the currency, and of course the current hot, it's not totally current, but it's recent and it's definitely a hot movie, was The Martian, which to most people's minds, and I read the book and saw the movie, and the movie paid reasonable homage to the book. The book paid good homage to the science. Various people critiqued it. If you weren't aware, Andy Weir, the writer of the book, that book first emerged in a series of installments that he posted on his blog, and he got his inside crowd of fellow planetary scientists, geeks, engineers, and nerds to comment on. And he asked them to poke holes in it. So in its sort of syndicated installment version, it got an enormous amount of feedback from very picky technical people before it ever got picked up as a book and published. So, to most scientists' mind, it's at a pretty high bar of scientific veracity. And the movie, you can judge it for yourself.
Milky Way, or even Mars, and the spiders from Mars. Out comes a man from Mars. Between Mars and Jupiter, there's a gap right now.
You're seeing some of the tropes of the movie. I've noticed in my circle, that catchphrase from Matt Damon, "I'm going to have to science the shit out of this," that has gone into usage. That's now just a trope that in the scientific community. Forget about everywhere else. So let's just in sort of summary, encapsulated form, show the two sides of Mars that are represented in the book and the movie and are legitimate aspects of Mars, especially if we ever go there. First of all, there's the kind of mellow Mars. And as you probably know, when these were real landscapes and not photoshopped or mocked up, they're Tunisia. So Mars is a beautiful place, there's no doubt. And when things go bad, they really go bad. So we have to represent the Mars mayhem as well. Yeah, so the Martian day is longer. A long day on Mars can be a really long day when things go bad. So what is Mars going to do? What's NASA planning for Mars? So I'll just summarize this briefly, get into the end here, and then we can open up for questions. NASA has plans, and NASA is taking, not surprisingly, a fairly staged and cautious approach, which involves, loosening our tether from the Earth. And the space station is still our place to build things, to set things up in zero gravity without paying the heavy cost of fuel to get them into orbit. If you construct things in the space station and send them to Mars, you're spending a lot less on fuel. There's still the idea of using the moon as a proving ground for technologies. For example, if we want to be self-sufficient, an interesting number, if you like, to keep in your head is that a cubic meter of either the Martian or the lunar soil, and these are both arid, apparently lifeless places on the surface, but a cubic meter of either of those soils can, with very simple chemical means, produce a liter of water. That's about a ton of soil. And that same soil, of course, by equally simple standard chemical means, can produce oxygen that you can use to breathe or make rocket fuel combined with hydrogen. So because getting stuff to Mars or the moon is so expensive, the cost of launching it, you want to live off the land. And in the core ingredients of living off the land are water and oxygen. And they're available. They're simply available in the soil. And in several of the NASA centers, I've been there and seen the machines that they can scale up to very large size. There are these little oxygen plants or water plants that can extract those ingredients from the soil. So that's the base. It's actually quite low tech, in fact. And so NASA is planning this very staged approach, and it's going to take a while. This is a vision of the Martian habitat that NASA might build in 20 to 25 years, supporting probably 6 to 8 people with, hydroponics and self-sufficiency and living off the land in the way that I described. You can also use sort of electrochemical techniques. You're dealing with no magnetic field, a lot of cosmic rays, a lot of radiation exposure. And so you can use simple electrochemical techniques to melt the regolith into slump block and sort of battle harden your dome, and again, not have to bring that material out from the Earth. And the timeline for this is quite long. This is the proximate timeline of Mars missions that are basically rovers. There's the successor to Curiosity, which will go, it's a twin of Curiosity that'll go in a few years. And it's down into the 1920s when you get the sample return missions. And in this, and you can see how timid it is, preparing for human exploration is sort of happening around the end of the 2020s. And so the NASA's US government's most aggressive plan for a Mars colony is sometime in the 2040s. And if you want to know why, the next graph explains it. This is NASA's budget as a percent of the federal budget. This is the anomaly of Apollo. It's, a Cold War driven space race with the Russians. Could never be replicated, could never happen that NASA would get 4 to 5% of the US budget. But a little more discouragingly for people who like space activity, notice that since in the last 20 years, the NASA budget has declined by a factor of 2 as a percentage of the federal budget, from 1% to 0.5%. So asking NASA to do expensive, difficult, ambitious things and then sort of criticizing them for not doing it or doing it quickly enough when their budget is declining, that's a little harsh. I mean, I understand some of the knocks against NASA, but that's a tough situation they're in. However, there's another side to this coin, because this graph is going downwards. This is the graph that's going upward. This is the number of billionaires in the US. This will just make you feel poor, but and the number has grown by a factor of 10 since the late 1980s, with glitches for the recession, the 2 recessions in the last 20 years. And in terms of what NASA has an $18 billion budget, and the free energy, to use a physics term, of what NASA can do new or commit to a long-term development is about $1.5 to $2 billion a year. That's putting it all in one basket. That's, it's doing a lot of Earth observing science, doing a lot of propulsion development, got to support the space station. If you just look at how NASA spends its $18 billion, it's got 1 to 2 billion maximum to play with. And of course, what you see here is that there are a few hundred people in the US who, if they decided to put their money in that direction, they could match NASA's budget. I mean, individually, a small group of them could match it for a decade. So there you go. There's where the game is. So I'll finish with another vision of Mars. And this is good because relative to my title, it matches fiction, fact, and fantasy. And I'll leave you to decide which combination of fact, fantasy, and fiction this is. This is Elon Musk's Mars. Just a few weeks ago, he announced his interplanetary transport system. This is a rocket that will be larger than the Saturn V, a rocket that took the astronauts to the moon. Has never been replicated in size and power. His rocket will take anywhere up to 200 people at a time into Earth orbit, then refueling and on to Mars. It's 500 tons that it can get into Earth orbit, dwarfing the numbers we can do now. These are spacecraft that will have, movie theaters and restaurants and facilities and amenities. Not a swimming pool, because it's going to be in zero gravity and swimming pools don't work, but it's going to have some real facilities. And this little summary gives you a sense of what it might be like. And whether he talks about 1 million Mars colonists, that's a century-long dream. The question of a viable Mars colony, in his mind, is going to happen faster than the NASA timescale. Okay, thank you.